So what if I told you that some of the greatest rock bands never even made it to the big time? Yes, that's right. Today we're going to look at 8 killer bands that could have and should have taken the world by storm. These guys had everything except the fame. Now get ready to discover the 8 bands that I bet you've just never heard of. Let me know in the comments if you have heard of any of them. Now welcome to today's video where I dive into the world of hidden gems from the classic and progressive rock eras. Now, we'll all know the big names out there, the Pink Floyds, the Yeses, the Genesis, etc. But we're here to explore the bands that never really quite reached those dizzying heights. And I can tell you there's quite a number of them. But today I'll be looking at 8 bands that had everything it took, but for one reason or another, they just never made it to the big time. The interesting thing is that each of these groups has been suggested by you, the viewers out there of this channel. So I thank you so much for these suggestions. Let's get into it and have a look at them. So, first up is Flash. Now, this band were formed in 1971 as a progressive rock band, and they were founded by ex-Yes guitarist Peter Banks. To begin with, they seemed poised to follow in Yes's footsteps with complex arrangements, beautiful musicianship, and a lot of ambitious symphonic rock structures. The self-titled debut album, Flash, in 1972, earned them some attention, particularly for the track Small Beginnings, which charted modestly in the US charts. The band's first 3 albums are really quintessential prog rock, filled with extended instrumental passages, intricate guitar work, and rich vocal harmonies that echo their contemporaries like Yes and Genesis. However, despite their clear musical talent and impressive start, Flash failed to maintain momentum. The absence of a charismatic frontman, perhaps, and a sense of being overshadowed by Banks' former band Yes contributed to their struggle for mainstream recognition. There was also internal tensions, and this led to Peter Banks leaving the band, further disrupting their cohesion. And by 1973, just 2 years after forming, Flash had faded out, leaving behind a legacy of underappreciated yet ambitious prog rock. Now, hailing from West Virginia and Baltimore, Crack the Sky were a band that initially found success with their 1975 debut album, but for some reason they never quite achieved the fame that they really deserved. Their music is an interesting blend of progressive rock with quirky, offbeat lyrics and sophisticated musicianship. The band's self-titled debut album was even dubbed Album of the Year by Rolling Stone magazine, which is no small feat. Then there's the track Ice, and this stands out as one of their most well-known songs. It's a perfect showcase of their intricate guitar work and sharp, often satirical lyrics. They followed the second album, Animal Notes, in 1976, and this was equally well received, but again failed to break through the mainstream. Crack the Sky's complex time signatures, layered arrangements, and these unique lyrics drew comparisons to bands like Steely Dan and Frank Zappa. Despite this, though, they never managed to reach the radio-friendly level that bands like Yes and Genesis had achieved, which perhaps kept them from that wider recognition. The band continued to release albums sporadically over the years and built a loyal cult following, but commercial success always eluded them. Now, formed in 1968, Colosseum blended jazz, rock and blues to create a unique eclectic sound that was really ahead of its time. Led by drummer John Heisman, the band featured an impressive lineup of musicians, including keyboardist Dave Greenslade and saxophonist Dick Henschel-Smith. Their debut album, Those Who Were About to Die Salute You, received critical acclaim for its fusion of progressive rock and jazz influences back in 1969, making them pioneers of the jazz rock genre. One of the most popular tracks, Valentine Suite, is a 17-minute epic that showcases the band's ability to weave intricate jazz improvisation with rock intensity. Colosseum toured extensively and released several successful albums in the late 60s and early 70s, but these internal tensions and the rapidly changing musical landscape led to the band's breakup in 1971. and despite reuniting a few times over the years, Colosseum never quite regained the momentum they had in their earlier days. This complex sound, whilst innovative, was likely too intellectual for mainstream audiences, and the rise of simpler, more commercially friendly rock bands pushed them to the margins of the industry. Formed in 1968, Colosseum blended jazz, rock and blues to create a unique and eclectic sound that was really ahead of its time. Led by drummer John Heisman, the band featured an impressive lineup of musicians, including keyboardist Dave Greenslade and saxophonist Dick Hextall-Smith. Their debut album, Those Who Are About to Die Salute You, in 1969, received critical acclaim for its fusion of progressive rock and jazz influences, and made them one of the pioneers of the jazz rock genre. One of their most popular tracks, called Valentine's Suite, is a 17-minute epic that showcased the band's ability to weave intricate jazz improvisation with rock's intensity. Colosseum toured extensively and released several successful albums in the late 60s and early 70s, but some internal tensions and the rapidly changing musical landscape led to the band's breakup in 1971. And despite reuniting a few times over the years, Colosseum never quite regained the momentum they had in their earlier days. Their complex sound, whilst innovative, was likely too intellectual for mainstream audiences, and the rise of simpler, more commercially friendly rock bands pushed them to the margins of the industry. Next, the band Illusion, and these were born out of the ashes of the original lineup of Renaissance, featuring core members Jane Ralph and Jim McCarty. Now, after Renaissance went on to success with a new lineup, these original members formed Illusion in 1977, and they aimed to continue the symphonic rock sound that they had pioneered. Their debut album, Out of the Mist, was really well received by fans of progressive rock, particularly for its lush instrumentation and ethereal vocals from Jane Ralph. Tracks like Isadora stood out as emblematic of their dreamy orchestral style. Illusion were unique in that they focused on blending folk and classical elements into their music and created a pastoral atmospheric sound that was more introspective than many of the contemporaries. However, the timing was less than ideal, and by the late 70s, we know that punk rock and disco had taken over the airwaves and there was little room for a band steeped in prog rock tradition. Their second album, Illusion, was equally well crafted but suffered from a lack of promotion and exposure. The band disbanded shortly after its release. Now, formed in Glasgow in 1969, Beggars Opera were a progressive rock band that embraced classical influences and dramatic arrangements. Their debut album, Act One, from 1970, included long theatrical compositions with complex structures and soaring keyboards, similar to the bands like The Nice or very early Genesis. The track Time Machine became something of a signature song for the band, showing off their knack for weaving classical motifs into their rock compositions. They followed up with Waters of Change in 1971, which is widely regarded as their best album, featuring the hit Sarabande. With its melodic complexity and atmospheric keyboards, the album captured the attention of prog fans, but their more classically influenced style meant they were often overlooked in favour of flashier, more accessible bands. Beggars Opera continued to release albums throughout the 1970s, but their experimental sound really didn't translate into commercial success. And once again, by the time punk rock exploded, their elaborate compositions felt dated and the band slowly faded into obscurity. From 1969, we look at High Tide next, and these were one of the heaviest progressive rock bands of their time, blending psychedelic and proto-metal sounds. Led by guitarist Tony Hill, their debut album, Sea Shanties, from 1969, is often cited as a precursor to the heavy metal genre, thanks to its ferocious guitar riffs and dark, intense atmosphere. The track Death Warmed Up is an 8-minute barrage of distorted guitars and furious drumming, making it one of the heaviest tracks to come out of the late 60s. Their follow-up album, High Tide, from 1970, continued in a similar vein, with long, jam-like tracks filled with heavy guitars and violin solos from Simon House, who later joined Hawkwind. Despite their pioneering sound, High Tide never achieved mainstream success, likely due to their uncompromisingly heavy and experimental style, which was too intense for the broader progressive rock audience. Raw Material were a short-lived progressive rock band from London that formed in 1969. They released 2 albums before fading into obscurity. But their blend of jazz, psychedelia and folk elements left a lasting impression on those who did discover them. Their self-titled album Raw Material 1970 is an eclectic mix of style. But it was their second album, Time Is, from 1971, that really showcased their potential. Tracks like Miracle Worker and Religion highlighted their ability to fuse complex jazz progressions with psychedelic atmospheres, featuring extended instrumental sections and philosophical lyrics. However, like many prog bands of the time, their experimental sound was a bit too niche to gain widespread popularity. Raw Material disbanded shortly after their second album's release, leaving behind a small but devoted fan base. Rare Bird formed in 1969 and gained early attention with their hit single Sympathy, a moody, organ-driven track that reached the UK top 30. It remained their most well-known song, often described as a haunting commentary on human suffering. Their debut album featured no guitars, an unusual move for a rock band of the time, focusing instead on powerful organ and keyboard arrangements, which gave them a distinctive sound in the progressive rock landscape. The second album, As Your Mind Flies By in 1970, was a bold progression in their style, particularly with the epic track Flight, a multi-part suite that blended classical influences with hard-edged rock. Despite these early successes and critical acclaim, Rare Bird struggled to build on their momentum. The band shifted towards a more mainstream rock sound, with later albums like Epic Forest in 1972, which featured more conventional guitar work. However, this move alienated some of their early fans and didn't bring in new listeners really, and by the mid-1970s, Rare Bird had lost much of their initial fanfare and disbanded in 1975. And there you have it. 8 brilliant bands that had all the makings of rock legends, but for various reasons just didn't quite break through to the mainstream. Now, if you're a fan of progressive and classic rock, these are bands you should perhaps check out if you haven't already. Their music is timeless, and in some ways they're more special because they remain real hidden gems in the world of prog. However, I first highlighted some bands from the 1970s that had been forgotten by many except the dourest of fans, and you should watch that video next. I'll see you there.